Some men find out their marriage is over with divorce papers. I found out on a Thursday morning in October, standing at my kitchen desk in a pair of reading glasses I have had since 2009, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at a bank transfer of $4,200 to an account I had never seen before in my life. I read the line 3 times. I set the mug down. I closed the laptop lid with both hands. The way you close, something you want to think about before you open again. Then I went and made a fresh pot of coffee I did not need. My name is Gerald Mack. I am 64 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I have lived here for 31 years, longer than some of the oak trees on my street, which I planted myself a spring after my youngest started kindergarten. I remember buying those saplings from a nursery out on Morse Road, 3 of them bundled in burlap. And the man at the nursery told me they would outlast me if I planted them right. I planted them right. They are 40 feet tall now, and they drop enough leaves every October to keep me busy for 3 weekends straight, which my daughter calls karmic justice for a man who thought landscaping was a reasonable retirement hobby. I am a retired mechanical engineer. 22 years with a mid-sized manufacturing firm out of Dayton. Hendrix Precision Components, if you know the name, though most people don't. We made specialized parts for industrial HVAC systems. Not glamorous work, necessary work. The kind of work that nobody thinks about until something stops working, which is also a reasonable description of how I have tried to live my life. For the last 9 years, I have co-owned a small commercial property management company here in Franklin County with my wife, Diane. We manage 11 properties, strip malls, a couple of medical office buildings, one self-storage facility out on Morse Road that has been a reliable headache since 2017, when the drainage system on the east lot decided it was done cooperating with gravity. We have 4 full-time employees and 1 part-time bookkeeper named Pat, who comes in every Tuesday. I drive a 2011 Ford F-250, dark gray, 194,000 miles. My daughter Reese calls it the Fossil. I call it paid for. I have replaced the alternator twice, the water pump once, and the rear brake assembly last spring, and I intend to drive it until one of us gives out, and I am not planning on it being me. I want to tell you something about how I am built before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. I am not a fast reactor. I never have been. My father was an electrician for 34 years, and he used to say that the most dangerous man on a job site is the one who moves before he understands what he is dealing with. He said a good electrician never touches a wire he hasn't traced first. I am not an electrician, but I took that lesson into engineering, and I took it into business, and I took it eventually into the hardest situation of my adult life. You trace the wire first. You understand the circuit completely. Then you act. I want to be clear that I love my wife. I want to put that on the table at the front of this story because I think it changes the shape of everything that comes after it. This is not a story about a man who was looking for a reason to leave. This is a story about a man who had 31 years of genuine partnership, dismantled by someone he trusted, and who chose to handle that dismantling the same way he handled every other engineering problem in his life. Methodically, completely, without a single unnecessary word. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Diane and I met in 1989 at a state engineering conference in Cincinnati. She was not an engineer. She was working the registration desk for a firm that sponsored the event. And within the first 10 minutes of meeting her, I understood that she had a more organized mind than anyone I had ever encountered in a room full of engineers, which is saying something because engineers are not generally known for tolerating disorder. She could look at a complicated system, a schedule, a budget, a room full of competing priorities, and identify which 3 things were going to fail before anyone else had even located the problem. I admire that about her deeply. We married in June of 1991. 2 children, our son Marcus, who is 36 and lives in Denver, where he manages logistics for a medical supply company, and our daughter Reese, who is 33 and teaches 7th grade mathematics at a middle school here in Columbus, and calls me every Sunday at 11 a.m. without exception. Reese has called every Sunday for 11 years. I did not ask her to. She just started doing it after her mother and I had a difficult stretch in 2012. Nothing like what I am about to tell you. Just the ordinary friction of two people running a business and a household simultaneously. And she kept doing it after things got better. And at some point it became the thing I count on more than almost anything else in my week. The property management company was Diane's idea originally. After I retired from Hendricks in 2015, she came to me with a yellow legal pad covered in research, vacancy rates in Franklin County, cap rate comparisons, a list of 12 properties she had identified as undervalued and underserviced. She had been working on it quietly for 3 years while I was still at the firm. That was Diane. She did not bring half-formed ideas to the table. She brought complete ones. We launched the company in March of 2015 with 2 properties and built from there. The division of responsibility was clean and comfortable. I handled operations, maintenance coordination, contractor relationships, and property inspections. Diane handled the finances, the leasing relationships, tenant communications, and vendor contracts. For 7 years, it worked exactly as well as 2 people who had been married for 24 years and trusted each other completely could make it work. I want to be precise about something. I was not absent from the financial side of the business. I reviewed monthly statements. I attended every quarterly meeting with our accountant, a man named Don Ferris, who has been doing our business and personal taxes since 2009 and who I trust entirely. But Diane managed the day-to-day account activity, the transfers, the vendor payments, the invoices, the payroll runs, and I deferred to her on those details because that was the arrangement we had agreed to and because she had earned that trust across more than 3 decades of marriage. I do not say this to excuse anything. I say it because I want you to understand that what she did was not an opportunistic exploit of a careless man. It was a calculated exploit of a trusting one. There is a difference, and the difference matters to me. The first transfer I noticed was $4,200 on the morning of October 9th. I had opened the business checking account online to verify that a rent payment had cleared from our largest tenant, a dental group practice on Henderson Road, whose lease was up for renewal in January, and who I was in the middle of renegotiating with. The $4,200 had gone out 2 days earlier on a Tuesday. The memo line said, Consulting Q3. The receiving account number was a string of digits I had never seen associated with any vendor, contractor, or service we used. I wrote the account number down on the back of an envelope. I closed the laptop. I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes with my second cup of coffee, and I looked out the window at the oak trees, which were at peak color that week, deep orange, the specific shade that only lasts about 4 days before it tips over into brown, and I let myself think. There was an explanation that was not sinister. There were several. Diane could have set up a new vendor account I wasn't aware of. It could have been a mislabeled payment to an existing contractor. There were explanations. I acknowledged them. And then I went back 60 days in the account history, because that is how an engineer approaches an anomaly. You do not assume. You look at the full data set. There were 9 additional transfers I could not account for. They range from $2,800 to $6,800. They totaled, combined with the $4,200, approximately $51,400 across 60 days. Every single one had gone to the same receiving account number. Every single one had a vague memo line. Consulting, admin review, materials Q3, vendor balance. The kind of language that sounds procedural if you are reading quickly and sounds deliberately obscure if you are reading carefully. And every single one had processed on a Tuesday. Pat comes in on Tuesdays. But Pat processes payroll and invoices from a list Diane prepares. Pat does not independently review outgoing transfers. I printed every page. I put them in a manila folder. I labeled the folder Drainage Issue, Morse Road Phase 2, and filed in the bottom drawer of my desk under 2 other folders about the self-storage facility, which is the least interesting drawer in a house, and the one no one has any reason to open. Then I went downstairs and helped Diane make dinner. And I asked her how the Henderson Road renewal conversation was going, and she said the dental group's office manager was being slow to respond, but she expected to have something by the end of the month. I said that sounded about right. We ate chicken and watched the news. I went to bed at 10:15 the way I always do. I slept fine. I want to be honest about that. Not because I was unaffected, I was affected deeply, but because something in me had already gone very still. Not the still of shock. The still of a man who has identified a problem and knows exactly what the next step is. The grief was there. I could feel the shape of it. I put it somewhere dry and quiet, and I left it there, and I went to sleep. Over the following 4 weeks, I reconstructed 18 months of business account history. I did it in segments, never more than 45 minutes at a stretch, always when Diane was out of the house or occupied elsewhere. I used a spiral notebook I kept in the glove box of the F-250 because I did not want any of this on a device that connected to our home network. By the time I was done, on the evening of November 2nd, I had documented 31 transfers to the same account. The total was $87,400. Not a round number. $87,400. Move across 18 months in amounts small enough that none of them individually would have flagged anything in a routine review. I want you to think about the planning that represents. 31 transactions. 18 months. Every one on a Tuesday. The amounts varied enough that there was no obvious pattern to a casual scan. The memo lines were different each time, but all plausibly routine. This was not impulsive. This was constructed. And it had been constructed by someone who understood our account activity as well as I did, which meant it had been constructed by someone who had sat across from me at the kitchen table for 31 years. I drove to Tom Reedy's office on a Wednesday morning in early November. Thomas Reedy, CPA, forensic accounting specialist, Reedy & Associates on East Broad Street, Columbus. He had been recommended to me 3 years prior by a general contractor named Dale Purcell, who had gone through a business dispute with a former partner, and described Tom as the kind of accountant you want on your side when the numbers tell a story the other person doesn't want told. Tom is compact and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of a man who has spent 30 years finding things that other people hoped he wouldn't find, and has made his peace with what that work requires. I put my notebook and my printed folder on his desk. He looked at everything for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up over the glasses. "You haven't said anything to her," he said. It was not a question. "No. Good." He wrote something on his own notepad. "Give me 2 weeks. I want to trace the receiving account and see what's on the other end." I drove home. I made dinner. That evening, Diane asked me if I had followed up with the Henderson Road Dental Group, and I said I had left a message and was waiting to hear back, which was true. We watched television. I went to bed at 10:15. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Tom called me on the morning of November 19th at 8:47. I was in the F-250 in a parking lot off Stelzer Road, having just finished a walkthrough of one of our smaller retail properties where a tenant had reported a roof leak over the rear storage area. The receiving account was registered to a sole proprietor business entity called Hartwell Property Consulting. The registered owner and sole signatory was Diane Mack. She had filed the DBA registration with the state of Ohio in March of the prior year. 14 months before I found the first transfer, she had opened the business checking account the following month. The account had received $87,400 from our joint business account across those 18 months and had disbursed $71,200 in outgoing transfers during the same period. Tom read me the disbursement categories. Hotel charges, Columbus, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville. Airline tickets, restaurant charges in cities I had not traveled to with Diane during those periods, and then 22 separate payments to an individual named Raymond Fitch, totaling $43,800. I wrote the name down in the spiral notebook. Raymond Fitch. Tom found him in approximately 4 minutes. Raymond Fitch, age 49, licensed commercial real estate broker, office on Polaris Parkway in Westerville, Ohio, 17 miles from our house. He had a professional website with a headshot and a list of recent transactions, and a tagline about personalized service and local expertise. I sat in the F-250 for 11 minutes after Tom finished. The engine was off. It was 31 degrees. I watched a woman in a red coat walk from a nail salon to a coffee shop across the parking lot, moving quickly against the cold, completely unaware that a 64-year-old man was sitting in a gray truck 17 feet away having the quietest version of the worst morning of his adult life. I want to be honest about what I felt in those 11 minutes. There was grief, the deep, structural kind, not the sharp grief of surprise, but the heavy grief of confirmation, which is its own specific weight. There was something else underneath it that I did not examine right away. It felt something like the moment in an engineering problem when you have finally identified the source of the failure and you understand completely what needs to happen next. Not relief exactly. Clarity, cold and precise and absolute. I called Tom back. I told him I needed the full written report. Every transaction, every account record, the DBA filing, the Fitch payment schedule, bound and indexed. He said he would have it by the 24th. I thanked him and told him to send his invoice to my personal email. Then I called Catherine Breen. Catherine Breen, Breen Family Law, West Broad Street, Columbus. 24 years of practice in family and business law. She was recommended to me by Dale Purcell, the same contractor who had recommended Tom, who described her as the most expensive good decision he had ever made. Catherine speaks at the pace of someone who has learned that precision is worth more than speed. She wastes nothing, not words, not time, not the slightest detail of a client's situation. I met with her on November 21st at 9 a.m. I brought my printed folder and my spiral notebook. I walked her through the timeline from October 9th to November 19th. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 2 questions. The first was, "Do you want to save the business or dissolve it?" I said, "Dissolve it. Clean. I'll rebuild." The second was, "Have you spoken to anyone else about this? Family, friends, anyone?" I said, "No." She nodded. "Good. Keep it that way until I tell you otherwise." She then spent 38 minutes laying out what she intended to do, and I want to tell you that watching a genuinely skilled attorney work is one of the more satisfying things I have experienced as an adult. It is not unlike watching a good engineer solve a structural problem. Every element has a function. Nothing is decorative. She would file for business partnership dissolution on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty, supported by Tom's forensic report. Simultaneously, she would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, with an attached financial disclosure motion requiring full accounting of the Hartwell property consulting account. Because the DBA had been used to divert marital business assets, the 2 proceedings could run in parallel, which would freeze the Hartwell account immediately upon filing and prevent any further disbursements. And then she pointed to something I had nearly forgotten. Our original partnership agreement, drafted in 2015 with our business attorney at the time, contained a provision in Section 11, Paragraph 3. In plain language, if one partner diverted business assets in breach of fiduciary duty, the non-breaching partner was entitled to full recovery of the diverted amount plus a 20% penalty drawn from the breaching partner's equity share. Diane had drafted the organizational framework for that agreement. She had reviewed every clause. She had signed it on the same kitchen table where she had been sitting across from me every morning for the past 9 years. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Catherine filed on December 4th, a Wednesday at 9:03 a.m. I was at the Henderson Road property at the time, walking the parking lot with a paving contractor, looking at a quote for resurfacing the north entrance. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. Catherine's assistant confirming the filing had been accepted by the court. I acknowledged it and kept walking. The contractor was explaining the difference between a full depth replacement and a mill and overlay, and I asked the right questions and took notes, and we shook hands at 9:45, and I drove to the Morse Road facility to check on a fence repair. Diane was served on December 6th at 2:15 in the afternoon at our office on Stelzer Road. I know the details of what happened in that office because Derek Owens, our property operations manager, called me that evening. He is a straightforward young man of 28 who has been with us for 3 years and who called me, I believe, because he did not know what else to do and because he thought I should hear it from someone who had been there. He said the process server arrived at 2:13, confirmed Diane's identity, and handed her 2 envelopes. He said Diane stood at the reception desk without moving for close to 2 full minutes. That Pat asked if she needed water. That Diane set the envelopes on the counter, very carefully, and looked at them for a moment the way you look at something you already know the shape of. That she then picked them up, said she needed to make a call, and went into her office and closed the door. She called me 11 times between 2:17 and 4:02 that afternoon. I did not answer. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The good dark roast I only make when I am sitting down to think through something important, and Tom's report open in front of me, and I let each call go to voicemail, and I sat with the quiet of my own house, and I did not perform anything for anyone. Her attorney's formal response arrived December 14th. Craig Hollister, Hollister and Webb Family Law, downtown Columbus. His letter was professionally composed and argued that the Hartwell transfers represented legitimate compensation for consulting services Diane had performed independently of our joint business operation, pursuant to a verbal agreement between us. Catherine called me after she read it. I could hear in her voice, just slightly, the specific satisfaction of an attorney who has seen exactly this move before and has exactly the right counter for it. He doesn't know about the Fitch disbursements yet, she said. When does he find out? December 22nd. Mediation. Mediation was at 10 a.m. on December 22nd at a neutral suite on South High Street. I arrived at 9:44. I wore a dark blue button-down shirt that I've had for 12 years and my good winter coat, a forest green Carhartt that Reese gave me for Christmas in 2019 with a card that said, "For a man who fixes everything." I did not own a briefcase. I carried Tom's full forensic report. 14 pages, tabbed and index, bound in a plain black folder, in my left hand. The conference room had a long mahogany table and windows looking out over South High Street. The mediator was Susan Park. Susan Park Dispute Resolution Services, 19 years of practice. She has silver streak hair cut efficiently short, reading glasses on a silver chain, and the patient attention of someone who has watched a very large number of difficult conversations happen at tables like this one, and has learned to wait for the moment when the room tells her what it needs. Diane arrived with Craig Hollister at 9:57. She was dressed carefully. Charcoal blazer, dark slacks, the small pearl earrings she wore at professional meetings. She looked at me once when she came through the door. I held her gaze for a moment and then looked at Susan Park, because Susan Park was who I needed to pay attention to. We sat. Craig Hollister opened with Diane's position. The Hartwell transfers were legitimate independent consulting fees. No partnership agreement had been violated, and the divorce petition should proceed as a standard long-term marriage dissolution with equitable asset division. He spoke for approximately 9 minutes. He was organized. He was professional. He was working with the information he had. Catherine let him finish completely. She thanked him for the overview. Then she opened the black folder, removed a bound copy of Tom's forensic report, and slid it across the table. The room was quiet. Craig Hollister picked it up. He turned to the first tab section, the transaction log, all 31 transfers, dates and amounts, and memo lines laid out in a clean table. He turned to the second tab, the Hartwell Property Consulting DBA registration, filed 14 months before the first transfer I had noticed. He turned to the third tab, the Hartwell account disbursement records. He was at page 7 when he stopped. Page 7 was a Raymond Fitch payment schedule. 22 payments. $43,800 total. Dates, amounts, and the memo lines on the Hartwell account, which were somewhat less carefully constructed than the memo lines on the transfers from our joint account. Several of them said simply, RF, personal. Craig Hollister did not say anything for approximately 90 seconds. He was a careful reader, and I respected that about him. He turned to page 9. He turned back to page 7. Then he set the report on the table and looked at Diane. I did not look at Diane. I was looking at the middle distance the way I look at a building elevation when I am checking load-bearing calculations. Calm, specific, focus on the structure rather than the surface. Craig Hollister asked for a 10-minute recess. Susan Park called it. They left the room. Catherine turned to me and said quietly, "He needed to see it. Now he knows what he's working with." I said, "How long do you think?" She said, "They'll be back in 8 or 9 minutes." They were back in 8. What happened in the following hour was not a negotiation. in the dramatic sense of the word. There was no shouting. There were no threats. What happened was a methodical reorientation. Craig Hollister systematically withdrawing positions that were no longer defensible in light of the Fitch disbursements and the forensic documentation, and Catherine methodically advancing the terms she had outlined to me on November 21st. The consulting fee recharacterization was abandoned. The partnership agreement's Section 11 clause was acknowledged. The question became not whether Diane's equity share was subject to recovery, but how the settlement would be structured and on what timeline. By 12:40 p.m., the framework was in place. Full dissolution of the business partnership, effective January 15th. Diane's equity share reduced by $87,400, the full deferred amount, plus the 20% penalty specified in Section 11, totaling $104,880. The remaining business equity, including all 11 properties, the operating accounts, the established tenant relationships, and the company's operational goodwill, transferred to me outright, the divorce proceeding to continue as a separate matter, with a financial disclosure motion withdrawn in exchange for full cooperation on the dissolution timeline. Diane's attorney to prepare the formal dissolution agreement by December 30th. I signed a mediation framework. At 12:48 p.m., Catherine signed as my representative. Craig Hollister signed. Diane signed last. I kept my eyes on the signature line of my own copy while she signed. When it was done, Susan Park collected the copies, thanked everyone for their cooperation, and the meeting was over. I put on my Carhartt in the hallway. I shook Catherine's hand and told her the work had been exceptional. She said, "You gave me something clean to work with. That's not nothing." I told her I would send a bottle of the good bourbon at the new year. She said she would look forward to it. I walked out of the building onto South High Street at 1:06 p.m. It was 28 degrees, and there was a thin gray sky sitting low over the city the way December skies do in Columbus. Not dramatic, just settled and final. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air, and then I walked to the F-250 and got in and sat for a while without starting the engine. I want to tell you what I felt in that truck, because I think you deserve the honest version. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated. A kind of tired that is not unpleasant, the tired man who has carried something heavy for 11 weeks and has just set it down. There was grief in there, too. Real grief. The kind that does not resolve cleanly just because the legal situation does. 31 years is a long time. Some of what those years were made of was genuine, and the loss of it is genuine, and I will not stand here and tell you otherwise. But underneath the grief, steady and solid, I had handled it right. Not dramatically, not reactively, the right way, and that, in the end, is the thing I will keep. I stopped at the grocery store on Morse Road on the way home. Chicken thighs, 2 large potatoes, a bag of green beans, and a small bunch of fresh rosemary, because it was Wednesday and I have made a version of roasted chicken on Wednesdays for approximately 15 years, and I was not going to let December 22nd be the day that changed. I came home to a quiet house, put the chicken in the oven at 375, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while it cooked. Reese called at 7:30. I told her it was done. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And I told her I was, and I meant it in a particular way you mean it when you have come through something difficult intact. She cried a little. I let her. Then I told her the green beans were going to get cold, and she laughed and said she would call Sunday, and I said I would be here. Marcus called at 8:05, which was 7:05 his time in Denver, which meant he had been waiting to call until after Reese had had her chance. That is the kind of people my children are. He asked if he needed to come home. I told him to stay in Denver, that I had handled it, that the chicken was excellent. He laughed and told me he loved me, and I told him the same. That was December 22nd. It is now the following April. The business dissolution finalized January 15th as agreed. I spent February reorganizing the operational structure, hired a full-time operations manager named Sander Tate, who brings 14 years of commercial property experience and a directness I find extremely refreshing, and restructured our bookkeeping arrangement so that Pat now works 2 days a week, and every financial transaction above $500 requires my direct authorization. The Morse Road self-storage drainage issue was resolved in February by a civil engineering firm that I should call in 2018. The Henderson Road lease renewed in January at a 6% rate increase. The divorce finalized in March. I will not give you every detail of that process because some things belong to the people who lived through them. What I will tell you is that it was completed fairly, finally, and with considerably less drama than Diane's attorney had perhaps anticipated when he first opened that black folder in December. I still drive the F-250. 197,000 miles now. The fossil, Reese calls it. I told her the truck is not going anywhere, and neither am I. I planted a fourth oak tree last week along the south edge of the yard where there has always been a gap. The man at the nursery, a different nursery, different man, same advice, told me it would take 20 years to reach the height of the others. I told him that was fine. I am not in a hurry. I know how to wait. The most dangerous thing in the world is a man who understands numbers deeply, holds his silence completely, and keeps a very organized file. 31 transfers. 11 weeks of quiet. 1 black folder slid across a conference table. And a man who drove home and roasted chicken on a Wednesday. Same as always. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.